This podcast is brought to you today by SafeMap International. Hey, on June 29th in Atlanta, Georgia, SafeMap is presenting Safety on the Edge North America, featuring Corey Pitzer and Todd Conklin. It'll be held in the Embassy Suites Hotel at Centennial Olympic Park, right in downtown Atlanta, very nearby the ASSE meeting. And it's an entire day of workshop around safety and the new view. It's open discussion. We're going to set our own agendas, and it's going to be a really good time to sort of talk about advanced knowledge of this kind of thing that we do all the time, this new view of safety. It's yours if you're interested. Early bird registration is $445, and you can contact SafeMap International, and that phone number is 604-642-6110. Now, let's go to the podcast. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Pre-Accident Podcast. I'm your host, Todd Conklin. How are you today? It's a great day. Every day is kind of a great day. I mean, if you really push me on this, I don't have a lot of bad days. I really don't. I mean, I guess gratitude, which was last year's theme, has kind of rubbed off into this year because mostly I'm impressed with the way things are going. And I'm super impressed with sort of how the world's slowly changing. We're having some impact here, you guys. It's a little bit unbelievable to me. It's every level, but the dialogue around safety is changing, and it's changing because of guys like Eric Hollnagel and Sidney Decker and James Reason, and I know I'm forgetting a million names here, but there's all these guys, Carl White, that have carried some heavy water for us. Not heavy water in the nuke lab sense of the word for all you nuke lab people that are listening. I'm just talking about heavy load, heavy lifting. Any water's kind of heavy if you have to carry it far. That's kind of cool because that change is happening. And that sort of leads us to today's podcast topic, which I have a certain interest in at a bunch of levels. So I got an email from Bill Hoyle on the 26th of April, and I'm recording this pretty close to the 26th of April. And I don't know if you noticed, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, but the 26th of April was the 30th anniversary of the Chernobyl failure. And that was a significant event at every single level. And it changed the way we looked at big catastrophic failures probably everywhere. And there was a lot of emphasis in sort of moving blame from operators not paying attention to engineers doing a bad job to designers doing a crappy job to the installation. I mean, you can just kind of move blame everywhere you want to go. What's interesting is out of that became, a whole new sense of understanding and conversation around failure that started with these horrible catastrophic failures. It's kind of like rail safety. Pretty much every improvement that's ever happened in the railroad has happened on the top of a tombstone. They sort of wait for something to screw up and then they fix it. And to a great extent, that's how industry was for a long time, and that's certainly where Chernobyl plays into this. And I don't know if you get Bill Hoyle emails. If you don't, you ought to try to get on that list. Bill Hoyle is this amazing guy. I really want him on the podcast, but he really doesn't want to be on the podcast. So if you know him or know some way to blackmail him or influence him in some way to trick him to get him on the podcast, I'd love to get him on there. Bill, this is for you if you're listening. I want you, baby. I want you. I'm pointing my finger right now. But Bill sent out an email, and he often does, and they're always really interesting. And it was a discussion around how the industry has taken sort of a preferential treatment of prevention. And I started thinking about this, and I want you to think about this because I see this as well. I'll go out and help a company. Let's say something really bad happened, and I'll go do kind of a peer assessment, and I'll look at a failure of some type, usually pretty catastrophic. I'll see a tremendous amount of attention paid to the planning, preparation, and prevention side of the house. But when I go out and look at the actual failure, I'll see very little attention paid to the response and safeguard side of the equation. And that's kind of what this article that Bill Hoyle sent out talked about. is that we've built a system where we've said we must prevent human error. We must prevent mistakes. We must prevent design flaws. We must prevent something from bad happening. And to do that, we want to be extra sensitive to the potential failure, listening to small signals, and we want to build good prevention into the system. In fact, what we're sort of saying is if the worker cared more or was more attentive or was more careful or was more predictive or was more psychic, the worker would identify all the places where the problem will happen and then mitigate those places before the problem takes place. And what's amazing about this is that it works. It works pretty well. I mean, it works really super well. In fact, we got really good at reducing error. We got really, really good at building systems that were sort of failure predictive and did not fail. In fact, we got so good at it that we started to think that that was the secret weapon. And when bad things happened, we didn't have any preparation. We didn't have any ability to respond. We didn't have any ability to react. And I want to challenge you today in our conversation to think about this, because what I'm saying to you is if we put our preference on prevention, is that taking away the intellectual need, the motivation, if you will, to also manage defenses, to manage capacity, to manage safeguards. You know, we don't manage fall protection based upon prevention. In fact, we manage fall protection based entirely upon response. You don't put a person in a fall protection outfit, right? That was a weird way to say that. You don't put a person in a fall protection harness and hope they don't fall. You put a person in a fall protection harness because when they do fall, you want to manage how they land. Now, that's a really interesting way to look at both sides of this equation. So if I could draw a model for you, I think it would look like, I don't know, there'd be three parts to it. The middle of the model would definitely be the bad thing, the consequence. The middle would be the explosion or the snap or the pop or the sizzle or whatever noise. The middle of the model would be the bad outcome. Now, on the left side of the model, the front end of the model, that would be all our prevention effort. That would be context and prevention and error reduction and error proofing and traps and triggers and error-likely situations and error-provoking situations and failure-provoking situations and conflicts and all the things that exist before the conflict, before the consequence happens. On the right side of this model, the other side, that would be all our safeguards and our preventions and the things that actually put us in a position so that when the bad consequence happens, we can manage the outcome of that consequence. We can't manage the presence of or absence of the consequence, but we can manage the impact the consequence has to people, to process, to production, to our plant, to, that's a lot of P's in a row. I should write some of this crap down maybe. That's kind of where I think we are. And what Bill Hoyle's letter said to me, and it was a really nice reminder, is that it's probably somewhat of a balanced approach. That if we put everything on reacting to failure, then we haven't done anything to prevent failure. But if we put everything on prevention to failure, are we ready to respond and react to that failure? And I think we have to sort of think about this, that we manage the prevention part of safety and we manage the response part of safety in parallel. In fact, Jim Joy would tell you they're coupled, that you always couple the critical task. That's kind of a Tony Machar word. You always couple that critical task with a critical control, and then I would add, and a critical prevention component. So you've got the critical thing that could happen, bad outcome, non-recoverable, icky, explosion. You should have critical controls coupled to it, what will prevent this from having consequence, and then critical planning attached to it. How can we plan this problem away before it happens? So take a crane lift, because a crane lift's a really interesting thing to talk about. There's, they're high risk. There's a drop zone, right? We plan for that crane lift. We plan pretty aggressively. We engineer the crane lift. We do the numbers. We do the math. And we manage the potential for error. We put in secondary qualifications, we cross-check, we use Star Tool. We do everything we can before we actually do the lift to make sure that the lift will be as safe as possible. But simultaneously, we also manage the drop zone. So we barricade, we make it hard to get underneath the load, and we do that to make sure that if all of our planning fails, if all our prediction fails, and the load actually does fall, an unforeseen outlier puts its little head into our system and provides variability enough so that the system fails, that when that failure happens, we're ready for that failure to happen, and we're ready to manage not the presence or absence of the failure, we're ready to manage the consequence the failure has. I don't know. You think about this, and you think, well, it makes sense, right? That's logical as can be. There's no problem there. But you go out and look, and I would ask you to look at your facility, look at your organization, and ask this question. How ready are we at any level to have the failure we're going to have? Or have we put all of our eggs on procedures and hazard identification and prevention, and have we sort of worked ourselves into a conversation where we truly believe that if we're good enough at preventing the error, we don't have to be prepared to have the error? That is probably something we ought to think about, and certainly ought to talk about, because it really is that balanced approach. When you go out and look at a high-risk system, I think you have to look at how that high-risk system moves across those three parts of this little model we just made up in thin air. What is our prevention? What is our hazard identification? What's our planning and procedures look like? What's the potential failure? What's the critical task, critical step, critical outcome? And how do we manage the consequence of that failure if it happens? And all of those things, I think, become really the capacity to create safety in real time. Now, that shift, and you're on this journey because, well, you're listening to this podcast, so that's pretty clear. That shift from seeing safety as an outcome to be achieved, if we identify all the hazards and mitigate them, and if workers are obedient, we will not have a safety problem. That shift from seeing safety as an outcome to be achieved to seeing safety really as more of a capacity that's constantly present in a resilient system, that shift is precisely what it is we want to try to capture. That's where we're going with all this. And if you look at really robust systems that are pretty failures relatively rare, if not unheard of, one of the questions you're going to have to ask is, what's the prevention side look like? What's the critical consequence look like? And what's the response look like? And I think you're going to find that all three are present, and that's where we actually do the work we do. A resilient system is a system that has the ability to sort of withstand variability, withstand the outliers, and withstand it successfully. It doesn't mean it doesn't fail. What it means is if it does fail, if it does warble or wobble or twist or trigger, that failure is manageable, understandable, and has very little consequence. When you think about it, I mean, you almost have to go to Gwande's notion of how systems happen. You've got a brittle system. That's a system that when it suffers variability, the system itself collapses. So a great example of that, at least from my life, would be the aviation system in North America. One storm in Chicago, every plane across the country completely screwed up, often canceled. It happens all the time. That's a brittle system. One piece of variability anywhere in the system ruins the entire system and means I can't get home until 2 days later. Sorry, I'm not making it about me, but it's kind of about me. Then you have this notion of a resilient system. So Carl Weick and Kathleen Sutcliffe and those guys talk about the notion of what a resilient system looks like. Now, a resilient system has the ability to recover, to fail and recover, to fail and recover. That resilient system becomes a really important way to think about how work happens. So a great example of a resilient system, at least in the world in which we live, would be fall protection. We've talked about it already, but if a worker falls and they've got their harness on and their lanyard is tied off and they're 100% hooked up, when they fall, the failure happens, but in fact it happens in such a way that the failure has very little consequence. But Gawande takes it one step further, and he talks about an anti-fragile system. And that's kind of the three-part model that we've been talking about. That's a system that actually gets stronger because it fails and learns. It fails and gets better. And so what's an example of that? Well, the one I would think of right away is a broken bone. So when you break a bone, when it heals, it actually heals stronger at the place where it broke than it was before it broke. I remember I worked for the Boy Scouts at this place called Philmont for 1,000,000 years. It was a great place. And I worked with this remarkable guy. His name was Lloyd Knutson. And he was this amazing leader. He's from Minnesota. But mostly what he was just this incredible leader. He was really smart. And he really understood the notion of resilient systems. I mean, he never used that language. That would not be a word he'd use. But I remember he would always tell me, he's quite a woodworker. And he would always tell me that glue is stronger than the wood. The glue is stronger. You glue everything, Todd. He would say, glue it up, use the glue. The glue is stronger than the wood. In a way, that glue sort of provides this notion of anti-fragility. That's a really different way to look at Chernobyl or Fukushima or any plane crash, British Airways 38, or I mean, all the ones we've talked about on this podcast. Because what we want to do is really understand that it's very seductive, it's very enticing to look at the front end of that equation and say we can prevent all failure from happening. We can. If we're good enough at using the STAR tool, and if we use error reduction, and if we really make a kind of a quasi-mathematic calculation of risk, right? Probability is low, severity is low, so low level of protection, we'll be fine. That's super seductive. I mean, that feels like exactly the right place where we should be in this. The problem isn't that it's not effective. I think it's actually pretty effective. In fact, I would suggest we should always do that. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. The problem is that isn't sufficient in and of itself. And so when Eric Hollnagel talks about safety 1 and safety 2, or when Sidney Decker talks about the new view, what I think they're talking about is the fact that the new view doesn't mean the old view is bad. Safety 2 doesn't mean safety 1 is meaningless. What it means is there's a balanced approach to understanding that what got us so far isn't going to take us to the next place, which is exactly what this little article that Bill Hoyle sent said. It said that there's a preferential treatment to identifying and removing failure, and in doing so, we've lost the ability to understand the importance of also safeguarding and defending failure. And that podcast, I think, is exactly what today's about. That's a really important piece of information for us to remember. And I'm not sure I have an answer. I mean, but I almost never have answers. That's up to you guys. I mean, I think we should micro-experiment some things, try these ideas out, do all the stuff we're doing. I mean, don't stop doing anything you're doing. But I do want to challenge you around this idea, are we actually thinking about the fact that we manage safety as a capacity on all sides of the model? Are we creating systems that are truly anti-fragile? Are we creating systems that when they fail, we learn from that failure and actually make a system that's stronger and better than any system we've ever made before? So I told you I'd go out and do these peer assists. And there's often really catastrophic outcomes, and they're often pretty horrible. And I used to go out and say, my job is to help restore this company, restore them to the ability to do safe work in a risky world. But I've decided that's not right. I don't really want to restore the company's ability to do work. What I want to do is actually restore and improve. I want to bring the company back so that it's better than it was before it had the catastrophic failure. And that is the podcast for today. I don't know what you think. I mean, kick it around. See what you think. I think it's a very interesting idea. It's just kind of a way to spend some time and talk, just you and I. I didn't interview anybody today. I didn't even know who to call to do this interview. I mean, these are just some ideas that I'm thinking about. But I want to challenge you to think out loud about some of the things we're talking about and see where it takes you. So I hope this helps. As always, you ought to learn something new every single day. That's important. Have as much fun as you possibly can. And for goodness sakes, be safe.